listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, my name is Silas Rose. Thank you so much for tuning into Awake in Relationship. So after 3 months of COVID lockdown, many people are reporting intense challenges and conflict in relationships. Sometimes it can feel like living inside a pressure cooker that's about to blow. Strong emotions easily take over, and suddenly the person that we love becomes an object of our anger, or in some cases even hate. So how do we stay connected to our sense of vulnerability while still expressing our deep felt needs in relationship? Tonglen is an ancient Buddhist practice used for opening the heart and working with our own suffering and the suffering of others. In this episode, I'm going to chat with Susan Gillis Chapman, Buddhist author and teacher, about this ancient practice and creating a safe space for difficult conversations. Okay, well, good morning, Susan. Thank you for joining me again.
Good morning, Silas. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah. So a lot has kind of changed since our last conversation.
Yes, indeed.
We had this global pandemic and then the murder of George Floyd and the global response to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just kind of wondering how it is for you riding this kind of roller coaster of change.
Well, like everyone else, these bizarre circumstances of being isolated and, when you're in public, you have a mask on, so it's really hard to smile at people and lining up in the grocery stores. But of course, what you're seeing on the news is really excruciating. And I think, like many of us, there's this feeling of, emergence, like what has been always true is now being seen.
Mm-hmm.
And the protests and the response is heartening. Mm-hmm. So, there's this bizarre combination of hope and isolation and and it does feel like a time that we have to figure out how to actually nurture these seeds of change rather than letting them go toxic in some way.
Absolutely, yeah, because you can easily go in that direction. And I do feel like it has been a very healthy, robust response. How does this kind of compare? Because you are, of course, alive in 1968, or kind of the height of the cultural ferment of the hippie generation. How does this compare?
Well, I think that generation had a lot more naivety in a way. And on the one hand, the violence was much more in your face. Students were shot in protest, and the Vietnam War was raging in the United States. And, the trauma was very vivid. And of course, the rioting in the Black communities and the Martin Luther King's message, and of course there was Malcolm X and a lot of other great leaders, but in particular Martin Luther King's message was so filled with the nonviolent movement and the contrast with the raging violence that was going on at the time in some ways made the path forward a little clearer for freedom fighters and for people who really wanted to integrate the message of love and justice. It's hard to. I think that in a lot of ways, my adolescent generation had a lot more hope, and now we're looking back with a sense of what happened. Where was all that change? And there's obviously we've had a the United States had a African American president and first family, but there's so much further to go. And right now, the whole rhetoric and the deterioration in how people speak to each other is really quite alarming.
Absolutely, and that's an excellent segue to kind of today's conversation. How do we deal with those polarizing conversations or difficult conversations, and kind of rediscover the sort of empathy and vulnerability that we need to kind of move through these difficult times. And so, we kind of both you and I, through a previous conversation, I don't know if this has been trademarked yet, but relational Tonglen.
Yeah.
It's sort of repackaging an old idea on some level about how do we create a space for connection using this kind of ancient Buddhist practice. So why don't we start with what is Tonglen?
Yeah, so first of all, it is a Tonglen, the two words. I'm actually at the moment wondering if they are Tibetan terms or Sanskrit terms. They sound like they're Tibetan. So essentially what they mean is exchanging self for other. And so this is actually a training that Buddhists engage in to reverse the habit of self-importance and to cultivate the natural instinct to open and care for others, which needs to be nurtured and cultivated because it can easily be, you could say, interrupted by the habit of identifying with territorial barriers.
And where does it fit in terms of the spiritual journey?
Well, it's become quite popular in the last 20 years or 30 years because Pema Chodron, who's a very well-known and loved Buddhist nun, has made it kind of the centerpiece of her teachings. And there's, of course, many, many other Buddhist teachers who have offered Tonglen. Where it fits in the actual path is it's actually not a beginner's practice, which isn't to say that we can't benefit from knowing more about it or even dipping our toes into it, but it is associated with what's called the Mahayana, or the second turning teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, or Buddhism. And so you could say the first turning of the wheel that the Buddha taught is all about, you could almost reframe it as self-healing, that we have to have a relationship with ourselves and with our own pain. And so the truth of suffering and the Four Noble Truths are very much the first teachings of the Buddha. And that you could say that's the starting point for all of us, is to, whether it's moment by moment or if it's the beginning of a spiritual training that we're doing, it always begins by changing the way that we relate to our own suffering. And then the second stage is to train in increasing our capacity to be open to the suffering of others.
One of the first things that the Buddha taught was the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of suffering. And I'm just kind of wondering why begin there.
Well, I've been thinking lately that what we're talking about in the contemporary narrative is about trauma. And I actually think that the word suffering in the Buddhist tradition, dukkha, could probably be very accurately translated as trauma. Because what trauma does is it shocks us into a desynchronization of our body and our heart and our mind. There's that's how the body reacts, or that's how our beings react to the shock of trauma. And so my way of thinking about it is that the trauma that every single human being suffers is the shock of being dehumanized in some fashion. And there's kind of a way that we pass on suffering from one generation to the next, as parents unwittingly pass on their unspoken fears and ways of objectifying and projecting on their children. And then the children feel that shock of not being seen, heard, or cared for as who they are. That's like the most simple psychology. But I think that if we start looking at the word suffering from the point of view of trauma, it sort of helps see a pathway about why we have to start there. Because if we can't begin by having a sort of a loving and healing and compassionate relationship with the way that suffering has affected us or trauma has affected us, then what's happening is we will continue to manage or try to manage that trauma in dysfunctional ways. And one of those ways, according to the Buddhist tradition, and this also is according to psychology, is we project. And as long as we're projecting our unhealed or unfinished trauma onto other people, then our world is divided into friends, enemies, and people that we totally ignore. And by friends, I don't mean healthy friendships, but more seeking rescue from our pain. And enemies are people who reflect back to us our unspoken issues. So it's always important, and especially in the Buddhist tradition, that we sit down, that we listen to our body, that we allow our body to take us to our heart, and to begin to recognize the difference between the felt experience of the heart that does not get carried away by a narrative of the mind, but is rather just simply felt. And then also get familiar with how the mind, how thoughts work, how conceptual patterns work. So this is why meditation, which is that restoration of that balance of heart and mind and body, excuse me, that's the starting point for any kind of communication that we have with others, because we have to restore, to whatever degree, we're not perfect, but to whatever degree we can, we have to be curious about what the message that's arising in us is, how it's coming through, what is it, where is it coming from, and how do we listen to ourselves before we communicate with others.
Well, let's kind of go into the actual practice and how Tonglen can potentially kind of reverse that trauma response. And I'm kind of curious, actually, do you need to be a meditator to do this practice?
Well, what is a meditator from that point of view? It's true that meditation itself is a training, but what is it a training in? It's a training in doing nothing. It's actually giving ourselves the luxury or the challenge to do three things: to be still, to be silent, and to experience solitude, the three S's. And whether that's for 5 minutes or whether it's for 5 years, or obviously that would be too long, but whether we give ourselves a retreat or whether we simply, allow ourselves to pause, that I believe is an essential ground for Tonglen. Because if you do any kind of exchanging of self or other without that fundamental relationship with yourself, then it's so easily misunderstood. And in fact, it's even hard to understand it conceptually if one hasn't had that experience or even the knowledge of what meditation means. So, yeah, I would say that meditation is, in that sense, is pretty much an essential basis. On the other hand, I think one of the things I've been trying to do with my work is to take some of those same principles and bring them into the whole topic of conversation, because a positive way of looking at that is that we human beings do that informally, or we have a longing for that kind of reconnecting with ourselves, and we have a longing to be open to each other. And so you could say that that mindful communication, or Tonglen, picks up and cultivates that longing and offers a method for how to do that.
So maybe just describe the kind of steps in terms of working with this practice.
Yeah, so if you were given a formal instruction in Tonglen, there are certain steps that you follow, and the basic idea is that you're reversing the most fundamental habit of putting ourselves before others, making ourselves more important than others. So step one is to connect to our healthiness and our goodness. That's everything I've said up until now about coming back to the space of a meditative, what meditation shows us about our own goodness, our fundamental goodness and healthiness. And then step two is to begin the imagination, and this is a contemplative practice. It's an imaginary practice. And I usually use the example of an air purifier. Imagine that you can breathe in pollution and breathe out pure air. So that's the exact opposite of what we normally want to do. We normally want to breathe in what is pure and breathe out what is contaminated. So that's why it's a challenging practice, because we're imagining the opposite. Mm-hmm. And so you can use that visualization in any way you like. I think of polluted air as sooty and claustrophobic, smoggy. So you imagine that on the in-breath, you're breathing in that sooty air. And then, what's an important part of that is that comes into the natural goodness and healthiness of your heart. And then it converts into the pure air. So it is important to realize that you're not kind of poisoning yourself, but that you're confident that you have the capacity to purify that negative experience and breathe out. I think of it, when I was thinking of George Floyd, actually, mm-hmm. I was thinking of it as sort of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Mm-hmm. Like, I breathe in your suffering and give you my breath. I want to give you the breath that you can't have. So mm-hmm. It's that kind of thing. It's like this natural wish that we have at a time when we feel powerless. Like, I wish I could take your suffering. I wish I could give you whatever I have right now.
And I think for 99% of people, that's kind of the natural impulse.
It is. It absolutely is. And that's what's important to remember, is that what we're doing is training in what is a natural impulse. So that's step two. Step one was touching in on the strength and purity and goodness. Step two is to do this imaginary reversal, that we can breathe in suffering and we can breathe out healthiness, in the form of imagining it being on our breath as polluted air versus pure air. And then step three is where we would actually bring to mind a person like George Floyd, somebody we love, a person that, my 95-year-old mother who's in a nursing home, somebody that you would give anything in the world to be able to help, but you can't. You're powerless. And so bringing that person to mind really personalizes the practice. So let's take George Floyd as an example we can vividly bring to mind. So again, we are literally doing this for him. We're saying, I wish in those final moments that I could have been able to give you this breath of life. And I'm willing, when I'm willing to breathe in your suffering, I am bearing witness. So I'm willing to know as much as I can possibly know, not just in my mind, but in my heart and my body, about what that feels like for you, what that claustrophobia and suffocation feels like. So I'm breathing that in, and I'm breathing out to you my breath. And then in the fourth stage, we take that very, I don't know, kind of an urgent, heartfelt visualization, and we expand it to include as many other human beings as we can. And this kind of builds on a lot of the other trainings we do in Buddhism, where we try to step by step by step by step equalize. So for instance, we could begin easily by imagining all the other people of color who have been lynched or murdered, and that we're breathing for all of them. But eventually we can expand that to include all beings. And even the final stage would be to imagine being able to do it for the police, the murderers, because ultimately you want to train to be able to see the whole cycle of suffering as including the perpetrators as well as the victims, the oppressors as well as the oppressed, because if at all possible, we want to see the biggest picture and have some sense of stepping out of the whole cycle of violence altogether, with the wish that all beings could wake up and create a world that is safe and dignified for all. So it's a big challenge, and you can tell just by those steps how hard that practice is.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very visceral. Whenever I've done Tonglen, I'm always quite surprised what a kind of direct connection, like mainline into your heart, it is, especially for folks that are not part of a marginalized community. It can be so easy to kind of intellectualize the sort of larger cultural picture that we're in right now, which is kind of hyperpolarization, hyperpartisanship. And I'm kind of wondering, for difficult conversations, using these kind of principles that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. So when I was writing my book, I was actually, living at Gampo Abbey with Pema, and I was teaching communication there and trying to take the principles that she was teaching from the Buddhist perspective and translate them into a kind of a sectarian, non-sectarian or secular version of communication training. And I decided to just keep it very, very simple from the point of view of recognizing the difference between being open and being closed. Assuming that every single human being knows what it feels like when you're open. When there's a softness that suddenly appears, or the openness when you feel safe, when you feel trusted. And it's almost like a night and day situation. Like when you're open, even though you can feel a tremendous amount of sadness, you can stay connected and feel yourself at the same time. And it's not something that you can teach someone. It's only something you can say, hey, look at that. Remember what that feels like. That's what we're trying to do. That what we're trying to do is create more opportunities for that. So I would take your question and say, how do we create more space in which openness is welcome? And so that's what I call a green zone. So in a space where openness is welcome, one thing you need is trust and safety. So at the beginning of any kind of dialogue, whether it's 2 people, whether it's 5 people, and I would caution against it being a large group.
Mm-hmm.
But the starting point is to have an agreement that the vulnerability and the clarity and the emergence of openness is what we're welcoming. And the flip side is that any kind of conversation or communication that starts to be toxic or painful is what we call being closed. Like, what does it feel like to be closed? And closed is defensive, closed is reactive, and closed is when we say and hurt other people based on how we're projecting on them. So this is really why I wanted to focus on that, that how do you recognize in yourself openness as a positive thing? Again, this is where the mind and the heart and the body are synchronized. This is where love and justice work together, because justice is clarity. It's not opinion, it's clarity. And then how do you recognize the moment that shuts down and you start reacting, and in that moment the other person is turned into an object? And once you turn anyone into an object, you are so at risk of wanting them to suffer. It's just, we do all these exercises in my work where we just go, how fast does it take when you shut down your heart to want to hurt somebody else? So it's, or you could do the flip side. You could say, how do you want to grab that person and get them to try and rescue you? Which is that whole kind of codependent, or what I call mindless heart pattern.
Mm.
So, the simplest answer is, number one, you need an agreement. And number two, I'm taking Buddhist principles, but they don't have to be Buddhist, that there's human principles about creating safety. And then within that realm, where there is trust, then hopefully there will be critical thinking and debate rather than just going along. I mean, what amazes me and kind of appalls me right now is how easily we just go along with narratives, and that there's no room for debate.
Mm-hmm.
It's like no matter whether you're on the left or the right or the up or the down or whatever, if you stand up and have a different view and call out, not calling out in the aggressive sense of shutting someone down, but inviting someone into a debate, saying, could we talk about that? And, that process of clarifying without turning the other person into an enemy
Mm-hmm.
has been lost. What we see is a total deterioration into this, really becoming the normalization of bullying and using speech as a weapon. It's horrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it happens both on the left and the right.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's tribalism. No matter which side you're in, it's like being part of the tribe means that you all have the same way of speaking and the same way of thinking, and there's no room for sharpening the sword, as we used to call it. Not the sword of the weapon of war, but the you could say the scalpel. Sharpening the scalpel that knows how to take out the malignant part of the conversation and allow the healthy part to flourish.
I think what we're talking about is just really creating a container for feeling and kind of meeting of hearts.
Yes.
And we've kind of invoked Dr. King a fair bit in this conversation. And one of my favorite quotes of his is power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And I'm just kind of wondering, kind of to conclude, how do we bring the head and the heart together, particularly when it comes to our political discourse, but also even our spirituality? What is the merging of the head and heart, and what does it look like going forward?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the pathway is the body, you know. So again, going back to our original conversation about trauma, if we look at the synchronization of mind and body, or the synchronization of heart and mind, or however we want to call that, that synchronization is the body. So even in meditation, we take a posture. We talk about authentic warriorship is the ability to have a strong back and a tender, soft heart. In my work, I talk about, the separation of love and justice as the either the mindless heart, which is the anemic codependent pattern, idiot compassion, it's sometimes called, which is the going with your emotions without the clarity of your mind. And then the flip side is the heartless mind, which is using intellect to justify aggression and harm and dehumanizing others. So, but those two patterns, which basically feed each other, that you could say that's the fuel of the cycle of samsara if you're using Buddhist language, that aggression and passion will keep chasing each other's tail that way. I learned that working in domestic violence. That the when you take someone's confidence in their independent goodness away and create a dependency, it just cycles this whole pattern of oppressor and victim. So again, it's a matter of trying to get as big a picture as possible, but on a one-to-one level, it's about the body coming back, learning how to feel. What does it feel like to be open? When you're open, your body and heart and mind are synchronized. It's already there. That's a flash of the green light. But when you're closed, the body is frozen, the heart is frozen, and the mind is frozen in conceptual opinions. And that's false power. And that kind of separation, that's what's happening right now in the abuse of speech. So, you could measure it by how we talk to each other, but the reality is that it is this desynchronization, and it's re-traumatizing ourselves over and over and over again by replaying that power struggle instead of being curious and coming back to the very soft heart, soft body, natural goodness of a human being looking out the window, taking a deep breath, smelling the fragrance of the lilacs outside the window, noticing the raindrop on the leaf, feeling the sadness. But, we have to come back to these micro moments where we recognize what healthiness looks like, and then bring those micro moments as much as possible into our way of listening and caring for each other.
Mm-hmm. And acting in the world, I think that's because we don't want to just sort of perpetuate the aggression and the violence, even not on a micro level. That's
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's what I call the word positive interruption is kind of a clunky word, but it goes back to what Pema used to do at the Abbey, which is pause. Get in the habit of pausing, interrupting, not going along with, again, it's like addiction recovery, just when the impulse to say or do something or react to something, when you bite that hook, do anything. Go outside, take a walk, drink a glass of water, take a shower, do anything to interrupt that pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, coming back to the body means coming back to a sense perception. What do I smell? What do I taste? What do I feel? And staying as much as possible with the body, because it will bring us back to the fresh start of the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to communication, it's very much about, interrupting what you want to say and pausing to listen listen to how that sounds in your mind before it comes out of your mouth, and how is it going to land in the other person. So do you truly want them to understand what you're saying, or do you just want to weaponize your words and it doesn't matter how they hear it?
And the cycle continues.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Susan. This has been a really powerful conversation. And I think, there's so much more to kind of talk about in terms of bringing this practice into daily life. So we'll definitely get you back.
Great. Well, I really appreciate what you're doing, Silas. I think it's awakened relationship is really where we want to be.
Nice. Well, thank you again, and stay well. And we'll
yes, you too. All right. Take care, Silas. Thank you.
Thanks again to Susan for this great conversation. And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you want to learn more about Tonglen, head on over to awakenrelationship.com and check out the show notes to this episode. And don't forget to hit subscribe. So until next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.